All right, I'm going to take a stab at this while I have a little time. It's probably going to need a little bit more research, and I've read a few articles on it. So forgive me if my facts aren't as quite as precise as they normally are. So you guys going to have to give me a little leeway. I'm just going to give you my gut opinion. Like I said, I probably have to do more on this maybe later in the week or later on the weekend. I'm not quite sure, but since it's in the top of the news, and as we know that when something's in the news, especially if it's emotional, we have to do further research and dig down into the weeds. But let's go ahead and give it a shot. The child detentions aren't new. They've been going on for, uh, I would say, since the Obama administration actually got in 2009, where they have been basically separating children from their parents. Now, in 2014, there was this big push, this big outcry about these unaccompanied children showing up at the border. And at the time, the way they word things, it doesn't make sense, because I really didn't investigate it. It wasn't really at the top of my list. Them bringing in unaccompanied children and actually resettling them, putting them into foster homes and whatnot. It's like, okay, they need children, and that's a good way to get them. I didn't understand. I didn't understand at the time. I said, how could children come from Central America? Central America is like 2,500 miles away, and crossing some of the worst terrain probably in the world to get here by themselves didn't make sense, because, you hear the term unaccompanied and you think that, okay, these parents got these children and paid for them with coyotes and whatnot, and actually brought them to the border. And I said, it doesn't make sense how you get 40, 50,000 children between the ages of 5 and 12 to actually show up at a border. How would they all make it? It doesn't make sense. And you know how you tuck things away when things don't make sense, and they show up like 4 years later. Now, 4 years later, the pictures come out about the children being detained and separated from their parents and all these news and film crews. Now it makes sense. So now you go back in and you start doing research. And when you start doing research, then you really start getting into the weeds. And this is a preliminary investigation, just a preliminary reading about unaccompanied children or children on the border. Unaccompanied children is a legal term, a legal UN term. Immigrant children that have been separated from their parents, separated from their legal guardians. That's a term of unaccompanied children. So if you think about the term unaccompanied and how it's a legal term, been separated from their legal guardians. So when immigrants come to the border and try to get in, and they get caught, especially with their family or with their children, guess what the parents are? The parents are illegal. So once they are detained, the children no longer have a legal guardian. So by UN charter, they can be resettled. Now, when the parents try to cross, they're handled by immigration, customs, and enforcement. So they go into an integration. They are handled by the immigration courts. In 2002, if my reading of the article is on point, and I'm going by recollection because I'm not really looking at it, I have to do a further investigation. I am actually going to put it together so you guys can actually understand it. In 2002, it was 2002, no, it was 2008, I do believe. The handling of immigrant children was transferred because of the UN being in harmony with the UN. was transferred from immigration to Health and Human Services. So they're handled in different courts. And the immigrant children are no longer immigrants. They're handled under the UN Charter as unaccompanied children. So they're basically handled by the welfare system and social services. So now the children coming across are being basically put into the foster care system. That means group homes. That means boarding schools. That means foster families. So now the 40% of, I think it's 40% of white women who don't have children, so maybe in their 40s, maybe even their 50s, that don't have children, are now foster mothers. And just like in 2014 with Obama, those children are being sent all over the nation. This big hubbub about the mistreatment of these poor children is just a setup. So now that you will feel sorry for these kids, and now they can be put into the foster care system. Now, to keep these children with their parents cost, I think they said the cost was about $200, maybe between $150 and $250. To put them in the foster care system under Health and Human Services cost $750. So basically, they are luring these immigrants up here and stealing their children. And once they steal their children, they will send them back to their country of origin. Those children will never go back. Those children will be raised to be American citizens and American workers. Now, on the face of it, you would say this is stupid. Who would be cruel enough and dumb enough to spend all this money to lure these folks up, put them in court, steal their children, and send the parents back? It doesn't make sense on its face, except for one thing. When you look at other articles and notice that white people are below replacement. White people are below replacement. They're not replacing themselves. And the next step to mestizos, or white folks that are close enough to their genetic material, is where? Central America, where you have a lot of Latinos or Latinos that try to make it up to the border. Now, you don't want to repeat Europe's mistake, which is taking in a lot of adult immigrants that are hard to do what? Hard to socialize. If you bring adult immigrants up that they have to have children on the border, it's going to take you, number one, you have to find jobs for the immigrants. That's number one. Number two, after a certain age, it's difficult to socialize people, and they form their own communities. You form your own pocket or separate communities that now the government has to deal with. And some of that stuff is negative. So what is the next best option? Instead of getting adults, you get what? Children. Because it's going to cause you less problems. Instead of waiting a generation or a generation or two or even three to actually fully socialize the population coming in, you do it directly. You get children from the ages of between 5 and 12, or 5 and 11, as the UN denotes it. Still a few 100,000 of them. You put them into foster care or boarding homes, and they become socialized white people or socialized Americans without the two intermediary steps of parents, because they won't get their Native American or the Central American culture passed on to them. They'll be almost like blank slates. And by the time they get to be adult, they won't have much of their original culture left, which is what you want. Basically, you have socialized and whitewashed children with basically no generations. They learned this starting in the 1830s with mandatory schooling in the Prussian school system. They started learning this. In fact, if you read the book, The Boy Problem, they tell you about group homes and orphan trains and things like that. So they've been doing this for, good God, almost 200 years. So they're very, very good at doing this. They did this with the Native American when they separated the children from the adults and put them in boarding schools. And those children actually came out whitewashed. So fast forward when you no longer need the adult workers as much as you used to, because you're going to have to find jobs and Social Security and all this other rigmarole, legal wranglings. If to bring in adults, they'd have to work and take up more material and have to adapt to the culture and all that kind of stuff. What you really want is the children, because the white women aren't replacing enough of Americans. So basically all this stuff, all this thing about unaccompanied children and all this separating families is about stealing children from not Native Americans, but Latin Americans. That's all it is. Like I said, this is just preliminary. You should have done more reading. I read about, good God, it has to be at least 10 articles, and I read the original UN law. So this rabbit hole goes deep. White people are slick, and they name things that will have you assume something else. You would think that these children are just lost and wayward children, and they just wander up to the border, and these poor dears are being taken in by the good white people in Western countries, and it's actually bullshit. They're actually stealing children legally or semi-legally, and by the people they can't defend themselves, which is immigrants. But like I said, I'm gonna have to do more on this. This is just something that it's like off the cuff. I didn't put it together as well as I probably should have, but I wanted to get this out. But this is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one.